Welcome to 5th grade U.S. History Home Learning Day 25, May 4th, 2020. 5th graders, it was great seeing you on the video conference this past week. It was good to see some of the notes that some of you showed on the camera of Lewis and Clark. That was awesome. And I did notice that there seemed to be a little bit of confusion about that mapping assignment from a few weeks ago. So I'll start with that. I'll just review that a little bit, and then we'll jump into the American history video that hopefully you saw last week. If you didn't, it's still out there. Please check out the description of the last video, and that link is there, and watch that. That's an excellent video, and we're going to talk a lot about that information today. Boys and girls, you should have all received this packet and worked on it the first 3 weeks. And I think the question that I asked that you didn't seem to understand as a group, and I know some of you probably did, was I said, well, put some color on your maps and add a key to it, or improve the key. And if you see, these are all black and white. So I was thinking that all you really need to do is pick out one of these maps, and particularly this one's really confusing. It could use a little color and add maybe a little bit more to the key. And here's a good example right here, boys and girls. This one would work well. Just take a few colored pencils, and this is New France right here. Maybe put a little blue in here, a little light blue, and just fix it up. And this would be the English colonies right here. So you could put a little, maybe make that a light red or something, and then color that light red there, and add the New France color right there, blue, whatever you did. And I don't know if you want to, just, that's all I was asking, something just to improve it a little bit. So, and I was hoping that somebody would send me a photo of that, and that would be awesome, just so I could see what you guys did. I know that there was some communication with Mrs. Z about some of the questions that were on these packets, and I understand she answered those, so that's awesome. You have an awesome homeroom teacher for 5th grade. Boys and girls, the American Revolutionary War video that you watched was an excellent video, and I made notes too. I took some notes, and remember I asked you to make a little chart like this and look for people, events, causes, and consequences. And I made some notes. These notes kind of show that your teacher doesn't have the best penmanship, and there's a lot of spelling errors there. So I did this instead. So I typed these up for you, and we can talk about these. These are some of the main points. If you watched that video, boys and girls, and you really got into it, took some good notes, and understood what was going on, you are going to be really ahead of many people in the United States. And those points that were made in that video are really the foundation of a lot of decisions that are made in the United States to this day. So it will help you make decisions in your life, and to be, when you're in the voting box, and it will help you understand why things are the way they are. Boys and girls, if you're missing a few of these in your notes, feel free to write them down as we go through the video, and stop the video so you can catch up. And let's just take a quick look at what we have here. The American Revolutionary War had certain people participating in it in certain groups, and we have those groups right there: the American colonists, the Continental Congress, Great Britain, British Parliament, the French, King George III, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. And then these were some of the points that I think you probably pulled out of the video, and if you know these things, you're going to, and remember them, you're going to do well. You have a good foundation in knowing about your American history. let's talk about each one of these a little bit. Now, as we take a look here, the American Revolutionary War had different groups of people and different people that were part of it. And the North American colonists basically were English people and people from different parts of Europe that were settling. And the story of the Pilgrims and how people came over to America. We've already discussed that. We have the Continental Congress. Now, the Continental Congress was made up of representatives from all the colonies, and they sent these representatives to meet and talk about some of the issues that they were concerned about regarding how they were being ruled by the British government. We have Great Britain, of course, and we know about Great Britain. We have the British Parliament. Now that's kind of like our Congress. They would get together and talk about the laws and the rules, and then they had their king, King George. He was probably kind of like our president. It was different. The British had years of developing their government, and when you have a king in charge, they're called a monarch. And the monarchy in Great Britain was losing a lot of its power, and it was being taken over by the Parliament. So this is the situation in which the Americans, the colonists, had to work with. So, of course, we had the French right here. They had just finished a horrible war with 7-year war with the British, and they were not very happy with the British. So they got involved on the American colonist side, and we have then, of course, some of the big names you need to know would be Thomas Jefferson, and we've talked about Thomas Jefferson a little bit already this year, and then Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. So Thomas Jefferson, we know of as working on the Declaration of Independence as well as being president, and his whole idea for the adventure that Lewis and Clark took when he was president. And then John Adams had worked on the Declaration of Independence, and they were participants in the Continental Congress, and as well as Benjamin Franklin, who was really a statesman, a diplomat who spent a lot of time not only in America but in Europe, working with and talking to the French and the British about American concerns. So these are important names to know that go with the Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War. And as we move over here to some of the other topics here, the French and Indian War, or the 7-Year War, which we talked about that a lot during the last video because it's really connected to Wisconsin, and we talked about the Battle of Butte and the Fox and the issues that may have taken away a Native American loyalty to the French. And that was a war in which the British had spent a lot of money and effort to win throughout the whole world. And they needed to recoup their losses. So they really were set out to have those Americans pay for some of that war, because the people back in Britain were thinking that, part of this war that we had was to keep those Americans free from the French. And however, the people living in the colonies really weren't thinking like that. They're not too interested in paying any taxes. So that led to a lot of upset people, and in 1770, a bunch of colonists were protesting in Boston, and you don't really hear a lot about this. You just think, oh, the mean British, they just mowed down the poor colonists, and that wasn't the case. The colonists were protesting, and to these few British soldiers that were standing there throwing things at them and just antagonizing them until they just lost their cool. And it was a confrontation that really was then written up a lot in the news, and not everybody got the whole story. So there's more to that story than the press at the time, the people who were writing things up were saying, and it depended upon your perspective. Who was the bad guy? Was it those few soldiers, those British soldiers, or was it the protesters? Okay, and then of course the Boston Tea Party, which I think everybody knows about that. You guys learn about the law, I think very early in your career of schooling is, that was an act of defiance that we're not paying for those taxes. We're not going to deal with you telling us, how much we have to pay for goods and who we're going to have to pay taxes to and whose tea we can drink and whose tea we cannot drink. So that was, something that really fired up the king. Like, who in the world do you Americans think you are? You American colonists. You're supposed to be British subjects. Well, it's time for you to learn a lesson. And he decided that, he'd been kind of soft on them, and the Parliament had been kind of soft on the Americans. Some historians would say, there were a lot of taxes already, but they just weren't collected. And now they're going to get tough, and they proposed a bunch of acts, a bunch of rules and taxes and things that the American colonists just thought were just intolerable. They could not believe them. So that led to the First Continental Congress to start getting together and talking about, well, gee, King, this isn't right. Let's work this out as good Englishmen as we should. And but the people back in Great Britain didn't want to have anything to do about it. That was far away, across the Atlantic Ocean, and they thought all Americans were just a bunch of backwoodsmen. And I realized that there were a lot of scholarly and business type people in America who really had some thoughts about, hey, we should have our rights. And one thing led to another. And the first shots of the war are always said to have been fired at the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775. Now, those were just little battles, but they really have a lot of significance in that people that really, up to this point, thought of themselves as still English were facing what they called the regulars. They had little militias, little community armies to protect their communities, and the regulars, the redcoats, were coming, and they stood up to them. And we don't know totally who really fired the first shot. Historians still don't know. It was fired in Lexington, and those few Minutemen, as they were called, American colonists, were killed, a few of them, and the British took that little green real quickly. It was a really easy thing, and they started heading down to Concord to find some arms. They heard some spies that told the British that, hey, those Americans in Concord are getting a bunch of weapons together because they're thinking about, defying us, defying the authority. And so the British soldiers headed out to Concord to get these. And on the way, they were confronted in Lexington. And when they got to Concord, because of the word went out of the small battle that happened in Lexington, everybody from the countryside started moving towards Concord, thinking that, oh, they're going to have to stand up to these British. And they did. And the British basically things did not fare well for them. They had to run back to their barracks, basically, and if it wasn't for some relief that had come, history would probably recorded maybe a terrific defeat, lots of death on the British side. It would have been very, very horrible battle. So, all battles where death and killing happens are horrible, but it would have been much worse. And remember, at this time, both sides pretty much considered themselves English. And the Americans the American colonists just wanted their rights like any British citizen had. A right to be heard. A right to have representation in Parliament. So it wasn't so much, they were mad about the taxes. It was that they were mad and upset and disappointed that the British would not allow them to be represented in Parliament and have a say. So the Second Continental Congress then convened, and they decided, well, things aren't looking good. It looks like there could be a war. So they had, a lot of people that were willing to stand up to the British, and they had to choose, and they decided to choose a leader, a military leader, and they chose George Washington to be the commander of the Continental forces. So the American forces that did, throughout the war, face off with the British. And now there was the Battle of Bunker Hill shortly after that. So basically, during the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Americans basically surrounded the British who were in Boston, and the British, they couldn't have that, so they sent their forces out to attack the Americans who were on higher ground, and they won the battle. The British did. The Americans eventually lost, and were fleeing. However, the toll that the British took, that means the number of lives and the number of people injured on their side was really high, and it really sent a message to the British and the British military that this was going to be a difficult struggle, that these American colonists were serious. And they were. Once deadly force is used, it's absolutely serious. The Americans basically had a moral victory. So even though the numbers would say that the British won, the Americans were pumped up. The colonists are like, yeah, we can stand up to the crown. We can stand up to these redcoats. We can do it. And but remember, many of them were still considering themselves English. So the Continental Congress, feeling that still between Englishmen we should be able to resolve this issue, sent the king what's called the Olive Branch Petition, in which the Continental Congress asked the king to make peace. We can work this out. We're good Englishmen. But King George, right here, the third, he didn't even read the letter. He refused to have any negotiations with these Americans, declared them disloyal people, and he was bound to set an example of them. So with that news, the Americans decided that, okay, well, I guess we're going to have to take things into our own hand. And the Declaration of Independence was written. We always give credit to Thomas Jefferson, but other people participated in that, like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, that was signed, and the Americans were on their way to fighting a big war, and an 8-year war ensued, and it was a very bloody war that involved different groups and somewhat of a civil war too, because some people that were living in the colonies, which were now they had now declared themselves independent, did not want to be independent of Great Britain. They considered themselves British and English, and they were called loyalists. Well, the American revolutionists and the loyalists did not get along, and they took up sides and they fought against each other. So, it's basically a civil war within the context of this greater war. Boys and girls, after the Declaration of Independence was signed, things were not going well for the American side. They had lost some battles. Their army was just militiamen. They were not a professional army. And, they tried some secret tactics, guerrilla tactics, all kinds of different things. But things were not going well when they faced the British. And they actually lost the battle for New York. And George Washington was losing his men. His men were going home. They're going home back to their farms. And they thought it was a losing cause. So he had to do something. So on December 25th, you know what day that is, Christmas, he decided to have a surprise attack. And that surprise attack we know of is the Battle of Trenton, December 25th, 1776. And this is where we hear the story about how George Washington and his men crossed the Delaware River to confront the British and defeat them. And it wasn't just the British. There were some hired mercenaries there. Mercenary people are hired to do war for you. They were Germans. They were called the Hessians, or Hessians, actually. And there were some British forces there. And basically, to put it in a nutshell, boys and girls, George Washington did a great job of planning this battle, and they won. Now, with the men that had stayed, he won this battle in a terrible weather, and some of his support troops couldn't be there, and he beat these British and their special force that they had, and it really pumped people up. Soldiers who had decided, I'm done. My enlistment's over. I'm going home, going back to my farm. I'm not interested. They came back and decided, yeah, we can do this. And that led then to other battles. But finally, a super important battle happened. A battle of Saratoga in 1777. The consequences of that battle were awesome to the Americans, because they beat the British. And so what? They beat, one battle. What's that? War is made up of many battles. What happened was that the French, who had just had that war with the British, decided that these Americans are for real. They have a possible chance of independence. We're going to support their independence. And they recognized these Americans, and not only did that, openly sent their Navy to help them, and sent troops and sent people to train them, officers to train them. And that was huge. The training by professional French soldiers. Now, the French soldiers were the best soldiers. Their officers were the best officers in the world. They had the best land army in the world. which I think we said in the last video. And the British had the one of the best navies, if not the best navy in the world. So this really helped the Americans. And the French were able actually to really create a lot of trouble for the British in delaying their navy and sending support to America across the Atlantic Ocean to help their soldiers. But the Americans still had some tough times ahead. They had to get through a rough winter at Valley Forge. And we often see artwork about that. But George Washington was able to keep his army together. And this really showed that the Americans were had diligence and persistence. And it did not go unnoticed. So the Battle of Yorktown was a big battle in which the Americans and French faced off with the British, and the British were on the edge of on the coastline there, waiting for reinforcements to come via their strong, wonderful navy. But the French Navy blocked them, and they couldn't get there. And things were not looking good. And the battle went on for, I think, 11 days, something like that. The reinforcements never did show up for the British. And the unthinkable happened. The mighty British Empire, their army was defeated by what people back in Britain thought was a bunch of ragtag, backwoods Americans. These Americans defeated our army? Well, yes, they did. So then the British surrendered to French and American forces at Yorktown on October 19, 1781. And that was basically the last big battle, or a few skirmishes going on. But then finally, the war was officially over, and Britain recognized the United States as a legitimate country in the Treaty of Paris on September 3rd, 1783. So that's an important date in American history. Some people might say that might be the American birthday. A lot of Americans think of this is the American birthday, July 4th, 1776, because that's when we said that we were independent. So, that's the American Revolution in a nutshell, boys and girls. Hopefully you can remember all those little pieces that we just talked about, and you'll be ahead of a lot of people, a lot of adults, and you'll be able to use that knowledge to get better grades on the road in middle school and high school. So these are basic things that all Americans should know. Well, I hope you enjoyed the discussion of the story of the American Revolution, boys and girls. And if you have any questions, please contact me via email, or your parents have my phone number. Of course, they can contact me, and you could, contact Mrs. Z, and I can get a hold of you. I'm looking forward to Zooming again with you on the Zoom video conference, either with Mrs. Z, or maybe I'll just invite you yourselves, and we can look at some of your notes and maybe your maps. So I really want to connect with you, boys and girls. So please hang on to those notes. Those American Revolution notes. We can go over those more, and if we have time, I did mention that I have some ideas for a little art project now. I understand you're pretty busy making your talent show videos and everything, but I still haven't forgotten about that, and we can talk about that. if you're too busy, maybe that won't work out. But certainly, please know the story of the American Revolution. Look at the video again. I mean, that's an outstanding video, boys and girls. And then, work hard. And as always, boys and girls, go Zephyrs.